They called him a ghost with no past, a man whose shadow seemed heavier than his footsteps. No one knew his name, but every eye in the saloon turned when he pushed open the door. The laughter was loud, the whiskey flowed, and the bandits thought they'd found their next joke. But before the sun set, they'd learn. Some shadows hide the deadliest storms. The town was caught in the grip of the kind of heat that made wood groan and glass shimmer. The sun sat high, unblinking, pouring its judgment over the cracked earth of the single dusty street. Stray dogs panted under the shade of porches, and the wind carried more grit than comfort. The few souls outside moved slow, like they were wading through molasses, hats pulled low, eyes watching without seeming to. The sound of distant hoofbeats broke that lethargy, a measured, steady rhythm, too calm for a man in a hurry. He rode into view on a lean, dun-colored horse, its hide dusted with the same earth that clung to the rider's long coat. The man's hat was pulled down enough to shade his eyes, though the lower half of his face was visible, sun-worn skin, a jaw set in quiet resolve. His movements were unhurried as he brought the horse to the hitching post outside the saloon. Without glancing up at the people peering from windows, he swung down from the saddle. The leather creaked, the dust puffed from the ground. He tied the reins with the absent precision of a man who'd done it 1,000 times, then stepped toward the saloon doors. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of whiskey, sweat, and last night's smoke. Ceiling fans turned lazily, doing little to stir the stale heat. A card game was in progress near the back. A piano in the corner stood silent with one key chipped, and behind the bar a woman with tired eyes polished glasses that would never truly shine. The drifter didn't pause to take it in. He moved as though he'd already measured the room before stepping inside. His boots echoed softly on the warped floorboards as he made for the counter. Conversations dipped into murmurs. Two ranch hands near the door nudged each other, one whispering low, "Ain't seen him round here before." Another voice from a shadowed table muttered, "Best hope he keeps riding it." It wasn't fear in their tone, more a wary curiosity, like the town itself was holding its breath. The door swung wide again, banging against the frame. Laughter came first, sharp and cocky, followed by the heavy stomp of boots. Clay Maddox stepped in with his gang fanning behind him, 5 men dressed in trail-worn leather and arrogance. Maddox was broad-shouldered with a jaw darkened by stubble, his eyes always carrying the glint of someone who'd enjoy watching you bleed. His reputation reached farther than the town limits. Robberies, burnings, and bodies left in ditches were his calling cards. "Look here, boys," Maddox drawled, sweeping his gaze across the room until it landed on the stranger at the bar. "Seems we got us a new face." His grin was slow and mean. Or maybe he's just too ugly for daylight, hiding under that hat. The gang chuckled, their boots scattering sawdust as they spread into the room. The drifter didn't turn. He slid a coin across the bar, his voice low and steady. "Water." The barmaid hesitated, glanced nervously at Maddox, then filled a glass. The sound of it sliding across the counter was almost too loud in the thick air. "What's the matter, stranger?" Maddox's tone grew louder, pulling the attention of every patron. "Too good for whiskey? Or maybe you don't got the stomach for a real man's drink." One of his men stepped closer, bumping the drifter's shoulder. "He don't got the stomach for much, Clay. Look at him, skinny as a fence post." The drifter took a slow sip, eyes on the water, ignoring the bait. Maddox didn't like being ignored. He closed the space between them, the smell of alcohol heavy on his breath. "We're being friendly here, boy. You should return the favor. Let's share a drink." He slapped a shot glass down beside the water, splashing amber liquid onto the counter. The drifter's gaze lifted just enough for the barmaid to see his eyes, steady, pale, and unreadable. He pushed the shot glass aside without a word. That quiet refusal drew more laughter, louder now, edged with mockery. One of Maddox's men leaned in, sneering. "Maybe he don't drink, 'cause his mama never weaned him proper." Another shoved his arm, harder this time. "You deaf, friend? The boss offered you a drink." The drifter's coat shifted slightly with the movement, and for a heartbeat, the barmaid thought she saw the gleam of steel beneath it. His hands didn't twitch, didn't ball into fists. They rested loose at his sides, the kind of looseness that came from control, not passivity. His eyes didn't wander to the men around him. Didn't dart to the door or the gun belts. He just stood, watching, waiting. "You hear that?" Maddox said to the room, raising his voice for the crowd. "This fella's too scared to even talk to us. Bet he's just passing through, gonna ride out before sundown, 'cause he don't want to face real men." The gang roared their approval, the noise filling every corner of the saloon. But the drifter still didn't speak. He finished his water, set the glass down with deliberate care, and stepped away from the bar. The sound of his boots against the floor was slow, unhurried. The scrape of leather against wood unnervingly calm. He pushed open the saloon doors, sunlight spilling in around him, and walked back to his horse. Maddox spat on the floor, his voice low but carrying. "Ain't over, stranger." The gang's laughter followed him into the street, a sound that carried in the hot wind like a promise of trouble. Outside, the town seemed to return to its sluggish pace, but a few eyes followed the drifter as he mounted his horse. He didn't glance back, didn't show a flicker of reaction to the insults still drifting from the saloon. Instead, he adjusted the brim of his hat against the glare, the shadow of it hiding his eyes once more. A boy sitting cross-legged on the boardwalk watched him ride off toward the livery. "Who is he?" The boy whispered to no one in particular. From somewhere behind a dusty window, an old rancher answered without turning his head. "Don't know, but I seen men walk like that before." He paused, the memory heavy in his tone. "Usually means someone's gonna die before long." The drifter rode slow, the rhythmic creak of saddle leather keeping time with his thoughts. Behind him, the saloon's laughter began to fade, replaced by the whisper of wind against the buildings and the faint groan of sun-baked wood. Ahead, the town stretched small and worn under the endless sky, every shadow long and reaching. He dismounted at the livery and led his horse inside. The stable smelled of hay and old sweat, cool compared to the street. He removed the saddle with the same quiet precision he'd shown tying his reins, then crouched to check the horse's shoes, fingers moving with care. The liveryman, an old fellow with a limp, watched him in silence. Something in the stranger's movements made him pause. There was a steadiness there, like the world could shake apart, and this man would still be unflinching. The drifter straightened, patted the horse's neck, and stepped outside again. From here, the saloon was still visible down the street, its swinging doors opening and closing as Maddox's gang drifted in and out, their laughter riding the air like a taunt. The drifter stood for a long moment, eyes narrowed slightly, the brim of his hat casting deep shadows over his face. The saloon was louder than the street outside, the air thick with tobacco smoke and the tang of spilled liquor. Lights slanted through dusty windows, catching the swirls of haze and turning them gold. Cards slapped against tabletops, boots thudded on floorboards, and somewhere in the corner a man laughed too hard at nothing. The drifter sat at the bar, a lone figure amid the noise, his hat brim shadowing his eyes. Clay Maddox lounged at a nearby table, one boot hooked on a chair rung, the other sprawled out to block the aisle. His men hovered close, all spurs and swagger. Maddox's gaze kept drifting toward the stranger, a slow smile pulling at his mouth. "Look at him, boys. Sittin' there like he owns the place. Quiet as a church mouse, too." The drifter didn't react. He lifted the glass of water before him, took a measured sip, and set it down again without looking in their direction. "Water," Maddox repeated loudly, as if tasting the word. "Now, that's a drink for a man trying to stay pure till Judgment Day." His crew snickered. "Ain't that right, preacher?" The sheriff sat at a corner table, eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his hat. He didn't move to intervene, just shifted uncomfortably and looked back at the cards in his hands. Across the bar, Clara kept polishing glasses, though her eyes darted toward the drifter with a mix of curiosity and caution. One of Maddox's men, a lanky rider with a scar under his eye, sauntered up to the drifter and leaned an elbow on the bar. "Come on, stranger. Have a drink with us. Clay don't take kindly to folks refusing his hospitality." The drifter's voice was low and calm. "I don't drink." The scarred man laughed, turning to the others. "Hear that? He don't drink. Maybe he's scared the liquor'll make his hands shake." Maddox stood, his shadow falling across the room. "Tell you what, friend," he said, his tone lazy but eyes sharp. "We'll make it interesting. Friendly little shooting game. My man tosses something in the air. You put a hole through it before it hits the ground. Nothing to it. He motioned to one of his crew, who pulled a silver coin from his pocket and held it between two fingers. See? Easy. The drifter didn't turn. Not interested. A hush rippled through the tables nearby. Maddox's grin faltered into something colder. Not interested, he repeated, the words slow. You hear that, boys? Mr. Quiet here don't want to play. Maybe he's afraid he'll miss and make a fool of himself. The sheriff shifted again, fingers brushing the butt of his holstered Colt. Clara's rag stilled against the glass she was holding. She could see the drifter's right hand resting near his thigh, relaxed, unmoving, not tense, not fidgeting, just there, like it was waiting. Maddox stepped closer, his spurs biting the wood. Maybe you ain't just scared. Maybe you're nothing but smoke, no fire. He leaned down slightly, close enough for the drifter to smell the sour whiskey on his breath. I don't take kindly to men who think they're better than me. The drifter's voice was almost too soft for the others to hear. I think nothing of you. That made the room tilt. Maddox's face darkened. Laughter from his men broke the moment, loud and forced. Hear that, Clay? He's got a tongue after all, one of them called. Maddox straightened, jaw tight. Toss it, he said. The coin flashed into the air. Before it reached its peak, the drifter's head turned just slightly, eyes following it. Clara noticed something then, his hands. No tremor, no wasted motion, just a stillness that seemed unnatural, the kind that came from long years and too many graves. His hand didn't move toward his gun, but she felt in her bones that if it did, it would be over before anyone drew breath. The coin landed with a faint clink on the floorboards. Maddox's smirk returned, but thinner now. Too slow, stranger. Guess you just proved my point. The drifter rose from his stool, the movement quiet but deliberate. He placed a coin on the bar to pay for the water and tipped his hat to Clara. Her fingers tightened on the glass, her gaze never leaving his face. Maddox stepped in front of him, blocking the way to the door. You walking out already? We're just getting to know each other. The drifter's eyes lifted beneath the brim of his hat, steady as a fixed star. Move. Maddox's lips twitched, not quite a smile. He stepped aside, but spat on the floor where the drifter would have to walk. Ain't over, he said, low enough for only a few to hear. Not by a long shot. The drifter didn't respond. He stepped over the spit without breaking stride and pushed through the saloon doors into the glare outside. Clara watched him go, her pulse a quickened drum in her ears. She had seen a lot of men come through that bar, all kinds of tempers, all kinds of bravado, but never that stillness. It wasn't fear. It wasn't pride. It was something else, something dangerous. Maddox returned to his table, slamming into his chair and tossing back a shot of whiskey. His men muttered to each other, glancing toward the door as if expecting the stranger to walk back in. The sheriff let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, but his eyes stayed fixed on the empty doorway. Outside, the sunlight turned the street into a blinding river of gold. The drifter walked toward the livery without hurry, boots kicking up small clouds of dust. Behind him, the laughter inside started again, but it was different now, less sure, with something frayed at the edges. Clara set down the glass she'd been polishing and leaned on the bar, staring at the doorway. Who are you? She whispered to herself, though she knew there'd be no answer. Not yet. By the time the sun had begun its slow slide toward the western ridge, the heat had turned the air into a wavering curtain. The town looked half asleep under it, but trouble never rested here, not with Clay Maddox and his men still breathing. For months they'd ridden in and out like wolves, taking what they pleased, leaving graves behind them. Folks learned quick to hand over coin, stock, or silence. Those who didn't ended up like Clara's brother, face down in the dirt, blood soaking into the street. 2 months hadn't dulled the image in her mind, his eyes open but seeing nothing, the echo of Maddox's laughter fading as the gang rode off. She'd buried him herself, the sheriff too afraid to so much as spit in Maddox's direction. Since then, the saloon had been her cage, her work keeping her anchored, though her thoughts often strayed to what she'd do if she ever found a way to make Maddox pay. The drifter hadn't left town after his run-in at the bar. He'd taken his horse to the livery and stayed there through the heat of the day, mending his saddle straps with an old awl and a length of rawhide. His hands moved with the kind of quiet focus most men only found in prayer. A pair of children wandered in, the Miller twins, drawn by curiosity more than courage. They stood at a distance until he glanced up and offered them a small, wordless nod. That was all the invitation they needed. "Is that your gun?" the boy asked, wide-eyed. The drifter gave a faint half-smile. "It's a tool. Like any other. Not for play." The girl reached out toward the horse's neck, hesitated. "She's real pretty." "She's mean when she wants to be," he said, and the girl giggled, emboldened enough to stroke the animal's mane. He didn't shoo them away, just kept working, letting their chatter wash over him like rain over rock. For Clara, who'd stepped out back to empty a bucket, the sight was strange. A man who'd faced down Maddox without blinking, now quietly humoring two dusty-faced kids. The mood shattered when shouting erupted from the main street. The drifter's head lifted, his eyes narrowing. Clara dumped the last of the bucket's contents and hurried around front, already knowing what she'd see. Maddox and three of his crew had cornered old Tom Harris in the middle of the street. Tom was clutching the straps of a grain sack as if it were the only thing keeping him standing. "Taxes," Maddox was saying, his voice a lazy drawl that carried in the still air. "You use our road, our water you pay. That's how it works." "This grain's for my stock," Tom protested, but his voice wavered. One of the outlaws stepped forward and slammed a fist into Tom's gut. He doubled over with a choked sound, and the sack slipped from his hands, spilling golden kernels across the dust. Maddox laughed, tipping his hat back. "Now look what you done. Guess we'll have to take it off your hands before it spoils." From her spot near the saloon doors, Clara felt her nails bite into her palms. She wanted to scream, to throw herself at Maddox, but she knew how that would end. Beside her, the sheriff appeared, sweat already beading on his brow. He watched the scene for a long moment, jaw clenched, then sighed. "You gonna stop him?" Clara asked, her voice tight. The sheriff shook his head once, almost imperceptibly. "You think I ain't tried? Maddox will put me in the ground, for I clear leather. He's faster than me, and I'm not dying for a sack of grain." Her stare was sharp enough to cut, but the sheriff didn't meet it. He just turned and walked back toward the quiet refuge of the poker table, leaving her with the bitter taste of helplessness. Across the street, the drifter had emerged from the livery, half in shadow beneath the overhang. He didn't step forward, didn't speak, but his eyes tracked every movement, where Maddox stood, where his men were, the way they moved when they were mean, and the way they moved when they were careless. It was the look of a man mapping a battlefield, even if that battlefield was just a sunbaked street. Maddox and his crew sauntered off with the grain, leaving Tom coughing in the dirt. A few townsfolk helped him up, their faces set in grim lines, but no one dared say a word against the men on horseback. Dust hung in the air long after they'd gone, turning the late afternoon light into something almost metallic. Claire's gaze found the drifter still standing in the shadows. His posture was loose, easy, but she could tell his mind was working. The way his head tilted slightly when Maddox had drawn near to Tom, the way his eyes lingered on the weight of a man's step, the looseness of a hand by a gun belt. He was reading them the way gamblers read cards. And though she didn't know why, that gave her a flicker of something she hadn't felt in months. Not hope, exactly, but the shadow of it. The drifter stepped back into the dim of the livery and disappeared from sight. Clara stayed where she was, the last of the sunlight sliding across her face, knowing deep down that nothing in town stayed hidden for long. Not grudges, not ghosts, and not men like him. The desert night came cold and restless, the kind of cold that cut through cloth and bone alike. Wind hissed down the empty street, rattling loose shutters and making the weathered sign above the saloon creak in its chains. The lamps inside still burned bright, spilling rectangles of yellow across the dust. Laughter and slurred singing leaked into the dark, proof that Clay Maddox and his men were deep in their cups. Clara lingered in the doorway after her shift, rubbing her arms against the chill. She spotted him across the street, leaning against the hitching post in front of the livery. He wasn't drinking, wasn't talking, just standing in the shadows like he belonged to them. Something in her chest pulled her forward before she could think better of it. She crossed the street, her boots crunching over the frozen dirt. "Why didn't you fight back today?" she asked, voice low so it wouldn't carry. The wind tugged her hair into her face, but she didn't push it away. "You could have stopped him." His eyes, pale and unreadable beneath the brim of his hat, met hers for a moment. Then he looked past her, toward the saloon's glow, where Maddox's silhouette moved like a king in his court. "I'm waiting," he said finally. "For what?" He didn't answer. The corner of his mouth twitched, not in a smile but in something quieter, almost sad. Then he tipped his hat and walked past her toward the livery door, boots whispering against the dirt. She stood there a moment longer, feeling the cold bite into her before she turned back toward the saloon. Inside the livery, the dark smelled of dust, hay, and horse sweat. He closed the door behind him and pulled a small oil lamp from a hook, its glow flickering over the rough-hewn walls. From under his bedroll, he drew a revolver wrapped in an old cloth. The blued steel caught the lamplight like water, its grip worn smooth from years of use. Along the edge, barely visible, were small notches, more than a dozen. He ran his thumb over them, slow, like counting. His mind slid backward unbidden, to a street much like this one but years younger, the air thick with heat and challenge. A man had stood across from him then, hands twitching toward his holster, eyes full of pride that turned to fear too late. The gun had cleared leather in a blink, the report echoing against buildings, and when the dust settled, the drifter had walked away, leaving another mark on the grip. Faces blurred over time, but the feel of each draw never did. He set the revolver on the crate beside him, opened a small pouch, and checked each round before laying them out in a neat row. The methodical work kept his hands steady, his mind sharp. Outside, the wind pressed against the livery walls, carrying with it the sounds of a town battening down. Doors were bolted, windows shuttered. Lanterns went out one by one as families huddled inside. They knew the rhythm of Maddox's temper, how a night of drinking often bled into a morning of blood. The drifter finished his inspection, reloaded the revolver, and slid it back into the worn leather holster at his side. He blew out the lamp and stepped out into the open, the stars above sharp and cold in the black sky. The street lay empty, save for the faint gold light under the saloon's doors and the shifting silhouettes behind them. He lowered himself onto the edge of the boardwalk in front of the livery, resting his back against the post. For hours he sat there, the revolver loose in his lap, watching the quiet town and listening to the wind. He didn't move much, but his eyes never stopped, tracking every flicker of motion, every change in the shadows. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote's cry rose and fell, thin as paper against the vastness of the night. The hours crept by, the saloon finally quieting as Maddox's laughter faded into drunken mumbles. A door slammed, boots shuffled, and then even that was gone. The wind calmed to a low hum, the night holding its breath. The drifter stayed where he was, face unreadable, waiting for the first streak of pale light to break the horizon. The cold didn't touch him. The waiting was what he knew best. The morning came brittle and bright, the kind where sunlight cut sharp edges across the buildings and the air tasted of dry dust. Hooves broke the quiet before the riders came into sight. Maddox at the head, his black coat snapping behind him like a torn flag. He sat tall in the saddle, his grin already spreading, the kind that made a man's skin crawl. The town stirred in his wake. Doors opened. Shadows shifted in windows. Men leaned against posts with their arms folded, pretending they weren't watching. A low murmur passed through the small crowd as Maddox reined up in the middle of Main Street, boots creaking against the stirrups. His voice cut across the morning. "Drifter," he called, drawing the word out until it felt like a challenge in itself. "I figure you've had enough time to grow a spine." The drifter stepped out from the livery's shadow, had brim pulled low, eyes hidden. His boots brushed the dust in a measured stride. He said nothing, but his silence seemed heavier than any words Maddox could throw. "Look at you," Maddox jeered, his voice thick with scorn. "Nothing but a coward hiding behind shadows. Folks whisper about you like you're some kind of ghost. But I see what you really are, just another sack of bones afraid to die." The drifter kept moving forward, slow, deliberate, like the space between them was his to measure. Clara pushed through the crowd, her face pale, but her jaw set. "Leave him be, Maddox," she said, voice shaking but firm. "You had your fun. This town's bled enough." The outlaw's eyes flicked to her, and something mean flashed in his grin. He swung down from his horse in a single motion and backhanded her hard enough to send her stumbling into the dirt. The sound cracked through the air. That was when the drifter stopped. He stood still for a moment, dust curling around his boots, then took one step forward. His chin lifted, and for the first time, the crowd caught a clear look at his eyes, cold, steady, unblinking. Maddox laughed, a short bark that didn't reach his eyes. "There he is. The ghost's got a little fire after all." They stood facing each other now, the space between them tight and charged. The street had gone silent, the wind holding its breath. A dog barked far off, the sound sharp in the stillness. Maddox's hand twitched toward his gun. The drifter didn't move, at least, not until Maddox's fingers brushed the worn leather of his holster. Then it happened, too fast for anyone to track. The drifter's revolver cleared leather in a smooth, fluid motion, the barrel flashing in the sunlight. 2 shots cracked like thunder, one after the other. Maddox staggered, confusion flickering in his eyes before the strength left his legs. He crumpled into the dust. For a moment, the world felt weightless. The crowd stood frozen, mouths open, as if no one could quite believe what they'd seen. Then a voice broke the silence. "Fastest draw I ever saw," someone whispered. Movement blurred at the edge of vision. 2 of Maddox's men went for their guns, but the drifter's arm moved like it had been waiting all its life. 2 more shots. Both men dropped before their barrels, cleared the holsters. The smell of burnt powder rolled through the air, heavy and bitter. The rest of the gang hesitated only a heartbeat before bolting, their horses' hooves pounding a panicked rhythm as they tore out of town. Dust swallowed them before anyone thought to give chase. The drifter stood alone in the street, revolver still in his hand, the cylinder warm against his palm. Dust drifted around him in slow spirals. The sunlight cut through the haze, turning the scene into something that would be remembered long after the gun smoke faded. He didn't look at the bodies, didn't speak. He only slid the revolver back into its holster, turned, and walked away. Each step carried the weight of something old, something he'd carried far too long, and yet lighter now, like another notch had been carved, unseen but final. The crowd parted for him without a word. Clara, still holding her cheek, watched him go with a mix of gratitude and something deeper she couldn't name. The street was silent again, except for the faint hiss of wind through the eaves and the lingering echo of shots that had already passed into legend. The square was still shrouded in the haze of gunpowder when the sheriff stepped forward, his voice low, reverent. "You saved this town." His words seemed too small for the moment, but they hung in the air all the same. The townsfolk, still gathered in tight knots, stared at the drifter as though trying to memorize the lines of his face. Some eyes shone with gratitude, others with fear, and many with that strange mix reserved for men who can kill so quickly it feels like magic. Clara stood apart from the others, hands clasped, gaze fixed on him. Her breath trembled as she asked the question no one else dared to. "Who are you?" He turned his head slowly, the brim of his hat shadowing his eyes. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint creak of leather from his gun belt as it settled against his hip. Then, in a voice roughened by dust and years of silence, he gave a name that fell over the crowd like the toll of a bell. Gasps followed. One old rancher muttered a curse and crossed himself. Another man whispered to his companion, the syllables carrying like a rumor through the morning air. They remembered. They all remembered. Long before the silver had threaded his hair, that name had been spoken in saloons from Santa Fe to the Dakota Plains. He had been a man who didn't miss, whose duels ended before most could even draw. But his legend was carved in blood, the kind that soaked into the ground and never quite washed away. The cost had been steep. Somewhere in the telling, the whispers shifted from awe to sorrow, because the old-timers knew the end of his story. A feud that burned too hot, too long. A family gone. A life left behind. He didn't linger under their stares. Without another word, He turned toward the hitching post, the weight of every step measured and unhurried. His horse waited there, the animal's dark coat flecked with dust, head bowed slightly as though it understood the road ahead. He placed a hand on its neck, fingers tracing the familiar ridge of muscle, and for a moment his eyes softened, the only gentleness he allowed himself. Clara followed him, stopping just short. She didn't ask him to stay. Maybe she saw it in his eyes, the truth that men like him couldn't settle, couldn't grow roots in places where people looked at them with more fear than trust. Still, when he put a boot in the stirrup, she found herself speaking anyway. "You could rest here. You've earned it." His hand tightened on the saddle horn. He tipped his head in her direction, a small, sad smile hidden beneath the brim of his hat. "Rest ain't for me." He swung into the saddle, the leather creaking, the sun catching on the metal of his revolver, the same one that had ended 3 lives before the town had taken its next breath. With a gentle nudge, the horse shifted, turning toward the main street that led out into the open desert. The sheriff stepped aside to give him room. The crowd parted without a word, eyes following the slow rhythm of hoofbeats on packed dirt. Each step seemed to carry a strange finality, like a page being turned in a book no one wanted to close. At the edge of town, he glanced back once. The sunlight was just beginning to burn away the lingering haze, casting the buildings in long shadows. Clara stood at the end of the boardwalk, hands at her sides, watching him as though committing every detail to memory. He raised a hand, not in farewell, but in quiet acknowledgement, and touched the brim of his hat. Then he turned forward and rode on, the sound of hooves fading against the vast hush of the desert. Wind caught at the hem of his coat, carrying dust and the faint smell of gunpowder into the wide, open emptiness. Some men leave a town the same way they came, quiet as a shadow. But in their wake, the world feels just a little safer and a little emptier.